Do we want to take a few questions here before we go? By the way, all of you of so many different ages have been so attentive.
You know, the brainless theory discussion about use and disuse, I think Lamarck.
Yes.
That seems to be just stupid.
It does now. And so, but at Darwin's time, it was considered the best scientific opinion of the day. And so the gentleman asked about use and disuse, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And Darwin believed that. So did the Frenchman Lamarck. So did most of the people in the 1850s. Believed that things that you did during your lifetime could be passed on to your children. Now, science was already beginning to show that wasn't working. There was actually a German scientist, August Weismann, that cut off the tails of mice. Scientists do weird things. Cut off the tails of mice for 21 generations to see if he could produce a generation of tailless mice. Guess what? Didn't work. You could cut off the arm. If a father loses his arm in his accident, it doesn't mean that later children are going to be born without an arm, does it? And so we know now that that's foolish. And it was shown to be foolish. Darwin published in 1859. In 1860, Gregor Mendel, an Austrian monk, published the theory of heredity as we now understand it. But nobody noticed it for nearly 50 years. And so evolution really got to start based on the false belief that just effort would make evolution happen. If a giraffe, an animal that wasn't a giraffe, a short-necked animal, would just stretch, toward the leaves and the tall trees, his neck would automatically get longer, and his babies would be born with her babies would be born with longer necks, and that's how it happened. It was just use and disuse. But we now know that's completely false. That's why our modern theory of evolution is called neo-Darwin. We kept the selection part, but threw out the use and disuse, which was called pangenesis. That was proven false, even though that was the most popular part of Darwin's theory. And most people don't understand that evolution really began based on ignorance of genetics, ignorance of cell biology, ignorance of ecology, ignorance of biosystematics. All these major fields of paleontology hadn't even been invented yet. And it wasn't Darwin's personal ignorance. In general, people hadn't discovered. They thought cells were like Jell-O, just little globs of protein. But now we look at them under the electron microscope. They're made of molecular machines, that make an automobile engine look like nothing by comparison. And there are bunches of these little machines in one single cell. And if we'd only known science better, or what? If we had trusted what God's Word said about God's world, we would have avoided a lot of tragic mistakes done in the name of evolution over the years. That useless, the idea that the human body had 180 useless leftovers of evolution. And at first, medical science fell for it and quit investigating their function. And they'd rip out organs that were very beneficial. Fortunately, we've quit believing that kind of evolution. And now we've found the function of all 180 of those. But not until they'd done quite a bit of harm, actual direct physical harm, to people over the years. Another question or comment? Yes?
What's the difference between a gene and an allele?
Gene is the broad term. And so allele is genes of the same kind. And so, for instance, if you talk about the shape of hair, you can have a gene for curly hair or a gene for straight hair, and if you have one of each, you'll have wavy hair, and so on. And then, so those are alleles, or genes of the same kind. And so you can have adult hemoglobin. Hemoglobin A is a protein that carries oxygen in red blood cells, and there's a gene for that. And then mutations of that are alleles. There's sickle cell hemoglobin is an allele of normal hemoglobin. Mutations are abnormal alleles of genes that already exist. And so evolution, notice I skipped it on the screen, but evolutionists love to use the word gene because it means so many different things. But all of the examples, every mutation that's ever been produced, regardless of whether you think it's beneficial or not, is an allele of a gene that already exists. It's just a variation in kind. I coined the word genon, so like an evolutionist look at a group like this and say, look, the children have different genes than their parents. Is that true or false? And the answer is you don't really know, because the word's so vague. You do and you don't. You have exactly the same genes your parents have, except with variation of those genes. You have allelic variation from parent to children. But if you're going from bacteria to people, you're not looking at just changes in alleles, just changes in the percentages of varieties of genes that already exist. If you're going to change a bacterium into a person, you've got to invent a new gene that makes a new protein that makes muscle. And you've got to invent a new gene that makes a new protein, that helps to make bone. And you've got to make thousands upon thousands upon thousands of new genes that make new proteins that are not alleles. And so all of the examples of evolutionary change are always alleles. If I could get the scientific community, should actually jump at that to use two terms. So when you're talking about allelic genes, you're talking about genes of the same kind. When you're talking about genons, you're talking about genes of different kinds. Scientists normally love that. They like to use precise language. They want to be understood. They don't want to confuse variation at this level